Welcome all. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's corporate program discussion. My name is Nikita Desai. I'm the Director for Policy and Corporate Programs here at the Korea Society. I'd like to start by telling you that we've had a long-standing installment of a number of policy and corporate programs that look at Korea-China relations. And this one today really examines the trade partnership and the economic relation between the two countries. Bless you. I'd like to start by introducing our key speaker, Jeff Schott here, who joined us from Peterson Institute of International Economics. Jeff has had a long-standing career examining economic partnerships, particularly trade. He's really the brain trust on free trade agreements. In the last 10 years that he's been at the Peterson Institute, he's served as professors at Princeton University and at Georgetown University. Prior to that, he was also at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and has had a long-standing career also at the U.S. Treasury Department. And to my left is our newest president, Tom Byrne, and so I'll just hand it over to Tom now. But before I do want to make a short logistics announcement. Please make sure your cell phones are on silent or vibrate. And in front of you, you will see that there is a survey. We would really appreciate you giving us your candid feedback on today's program. So warm welcome to our speaker and handing off. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you all for showing up this afternoon. Jeff, let me start off with a general question. 15 years ago, Korea didn't have any free trade agreements. Now it has the most, at least numerically, in the world, I understand. So how did Korea get from there to here? What prompted this big push for opening and entering into free trade agreements?
Well, I guess the answer would be enlightened self-interest. 15 years ago, Korea was fairly comfortable with its role in the World Trade Organization, but it faced a rather difficult challenge in the neighborhood, particularly with the rapid growth and economic power of China. It wasn't doing anything. And it had just come out of the financial crisis, the late 90s. And so what to do? Interestingly, I got a call at that time from Han Duck-soo, who at the time was trade minister. And he went on to bigger and better things and doing important work still today for Korea. And he asked me if I would look into the pros and cons of the United States and Korea negotiating a free trade agreement. Well, nobody was talking about it in the United States, and nobody was interested in doing it in Korea. The manufacturers were concerned about too much competition. The farmers obviously were against anything. The service companies didn't want the competition. They felt they weren't internationally competitive. Labor unions were against it. It seemed like the only one in Korea, and after doing an extensive survey around the country of various groups, the only one in Korea that wanted to look into a free trade agreement was Han Duck-soo. And so I asked, well, why? And it's interesting. He had a very important and strategic vision. And he said, the only way that we can really quickly boost competition in the Korean marketplace and push the economic reforms that we need at home to increase the efficiency of Korean industry and to boost productivity is to work on a trade agreement that will expand our trading opportunities and open the Korean market for more investment and more competition. He said, that's how we keep pace and stay ahead of China. That's how we grow the Korean economy and increase our opportunities for Koreans to work and thrive. It was really quite an important and prescient vision, and one that had to be implemented. Korea didn't start with the United States. In fact, when we did our report, it went over like a lead balloon in both Washington and Seoul. But it was there in case the situations changed where government officials would be in a position politically to take advantage. And so Korea first negotiated a free trade agreement with Chile, sort of learning by doing. That's what trade negotiators do. They find out what problems really exist and how to solve them only when you actually have to try to put pen to paper and solve that problem in an international agreement. And so by learning by doing, the Korean negotiators became better prepared to do bigger and much more important trade agreements with the United States and the European Union. But while this was all going on, China was becoming a much more important trading partner. And in fact, China, just a few years later, became Korea's #1 trading partner by 2004. And if you look at the growth of Korean trade over the past 15 years, overall trade, merchandise trade, has grown over 3 times, but trade with China has grown 8 times. And yet, it hasn't been a constant upward path. The growth of trade with China has actually flattened out over the last several years. And that inspired the view that with everything else, Korea should focus on its #1 trading partner and try to work out a better trading relationship and a foundation for expanding trade and investment with China. The aspirations were that this would be the best deal that China ever negotiated with anyone else, not up to the standards of the Chorus FTA or the Korea-European Union FTA, but one that would open up great new opportunities for Korean traders and investors with China. But I regret to say that in the event, the negotiators came up short. And we can talk about why, but if you read many of the economic forecasts for the impetus to growth in trade and output from the Korea-China Free Trade Agreement, which was just signed in June of this year, it's not yet entered into force, that those projections are a bit too high. They assume a level of reform across the board on trade and investment that was not achieved in the initial negotiations and may not be achieved for several years going forward as the negotiators go back to the bargaining table in a couple of years to amplify the results of the initial agreement that was reached in the past year.
Right. Well, on a administrative or technical level, setting aside the economic benefits, the two countries' legislatures have to sign this into law, right? That hasn't happened yet in South Korea. I'm not sure of the process in China, but are there any impediments or any surprises ahead, or is this pretty much a done deal, you think?
Politics are more predictable in China. I think the People's Congress will act on it at the appropriate time.
Right.
But the actions of the National Assembly are a little less predictable. Indeed, we found that out in the Chorus FTA process, where because of problems in both the Congress and in the National Assembly, implementation of the deal was delayed for 4.5 years. Just a couple of, in the past few weeks, leaders of both Korea and China agreed that they would press to finish implementation and ratification of the trade agreement before the end of the year. So that's a big political push that is going on now in Seoul. The session of the National Assembly, I believe, ends in a few weeks. So there isn't that much time left to do the work before the political deadline that was set. There are other distractions basically of domestic political nature in Korea that may get in the way. But far be it from me sitting in Washington to forecast what the National Assembly is going to do.
Mhm.
I think it will pass. I think there's strong support for it once
Mhm.
it gets through the process.
Mhm.
Whether that happens at the end of this year or early next year, I think won't make that big a
Mhm.
difference.
Right.
And then the People's Congress in
Right.
Beijing will
Right.
act accordingly.
Right. As you noted earlier, merchandise trade between China and Korea has boomed over the past decade. Um, but what about trade and services and also investment? The investment picture seems to be a bit mixed and hard to read uh, between Korea and China. Does this free trade agreement pave the way for a greater trade and services or greater investment? What's your impression?
It should, and here again, it's fallen a little short.
Mm-hmm.
On the investment side, actually, Korea and China signed an agreement along with Japan a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
China, Japan, Korea Investment Pact
Mm-hmm.
entered into force in May of 2014. And it contains many
Mm-hmm.
of the investment provisions and obligations that are normally in a free trade agreement. It does not apply to pre-establishment investments,
Mm-hmm.
and so that is a bit of a
Mm-hmm.
disadvantage. Uh, it hasn't made that big a difference for Korean
Mm-hmm.
investors in China since it entered into force,
Mm-hmm.
from what I've heard from Korean businessmen. Um, and it has only been modestly augmented by
Mm-hmm.
the Korea-China Pact.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but there are, for example, various protections for
Mm-hmm.
investors. There are investor-state dispute settlement
Mm-hmm.
procedures,
Mm-hmm.
controversial in some markets, but
Mm-hmm.
included in in most of China's investment
Mm-hmm.
agreements. Um, and remember that Korea and China have a
Mm-hmm.
bilateral investment treaty that goes back almost 20 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that was
Mm-hmm.
updated in part by this trilateral pact.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the reasons why you've seen a substantial growth in Korean investment in the Chinese market.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Another reason for that investment is that China maintains relatively high protectionist barriers against trade. And so for some industries, like in automobiles, you have to jump the tariff walls
Mm-hmm.
to get and produce in China to be able to serve the growing Chinese auto
Mm-hmm.
market. And indeed, China is now the largest auto market in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that, by the way, is an area where the free trade agreement comes up short, and autos have been excluded from the trade liberalization of the
Mm-hmm.
pact, and that's a large part of production
Mm-hmm.
and the commercial relationship between Korea and China. And I think the purpose there was very straightforward. The Chinese wanted to encourage further Korean investment in production in China using Chinese components and to
Right.
build up and
Right.
strengthen
Right.
their productive capacity.
Right.
And so it has short-term
Mm-hmm.
advantages for some Korean firms, but
Mm-hmm.
at the risk of some long-term risks.
Right. Right. Is there, staying on the investment angle, are there any, what are the trends in Chinese investment in South Korea? What type of FDI is going on or
It's
could
very
pick up?
small.
It's very small.
It's
Yeah.
very small. I think it's about
Mm-hmm.
oh, I don't have the numbers at the top of my head,
Yeah.
but there haven't been that many
Right.
opportunities, and I think China has been looking in terms of its overseas investments more towards developing natural resources,
Right. Right.
uh, and so have been looking to other markets.
like Indonesia and the region. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, right. Um, well, if I switch gears a little bit, at least
But I didn't I
okay,
didn't
go
I
ahead.
didn't I didn't answer your question though on services.
Ah,
And
of course. Yeah. Hmm.
services are included
Hmm.
in the Korea-China deal, but not very much. Uh, there was a very minimal effort to include services trade reform in the existing agreement. Uh, the negotiators agreed to pursue what they call a positive list approach to negotiation, which is basically a bottom-up approach that you liberalize by specifying the areas or the activities that will be subject to reform and
Hmm.
greater access. Well, obviously, that is a much more difficult and ponderous and more limiting approach
Hmm.
to liberalization than if you say everything is going to be liberalized except the specific activities that we
Hmm.
exclude from that liberalization. That's called a negative list
Hmm.
approach to negotiating. Well, in the first round, in this current agreement, the two sides adopted this positive list approach with only very minimal reforms in a few areas of professional
Mm.
services, primarily, that are subject to reform. It doesn't have a great economic impact overall. It will help business activities for some
Mhm.
activities. But the two governments agreed to re-engage on services negotiations 2 years after entry into force uh, of the agreement, and base their negotiations on a negative list approach,
Mhm.
so that there would be a greater opportunity
Mhm.
for services reforms going forward. Uh, I suspect that the negotiation will be overtaken by events in other negotiating forums, including in the
Right.
WTO,
Right. Mhm.
where services reforms will proceed on a
Mhm.
faster pace.
Okay. Good. Yeah, I noticed in some of the background data that I received in preparation for your talk that, in terms of services, the legal and professional services categories are highly restrictive in both countries.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, I don't know if this is an area that has been targeted for further liberalization.
Well, it certainly was high on the priority
Yeah.
of the U.S. negotiators in the Chorus
Right.
FTA,
Right.
because we wanted to export a lot of our lawyers to Seoul. We have a surplus.
Okay. Um, well, let me see. Is there anything you would like to say about the China Korea FTA before I move on to, at least when I was in Seoul a couple of weeks ago, that overshadowed the China Korea FTA, and that's this issue of Korea joining the TPP or
Mhm.
not being an original member of the TPP,
Yeah.
and whether the Koreans missed an opportunity there and what they will do to make up for that. So I'll ask a two-part question, and then you could perhaps this would be the last question before we do turn to Q&A. But um, so, what about the TPP? Is this overshadowing? Will it in any way detract from the implementation of the China Korea FTA? And then the second part of that question is, it looks like Korea will eventually join the TPP. If I had to guess,
Mhm.
from what I read superficially and through some conversations I've had with uh, businessmen more directly affected. Will China also join the TPP? Is that in the cards, or what are the internal, external, economic, political obstacles to China joining the TPP?
Okay. Uh, let me start with the easier part A. Uh, Actually, Korea has been looking at the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations for a long time. When Park Tae-ho was trade minister, one of Korea's really preeminent trade
Hmm.
economists and a professor at Seoul National University now, uh, he gave a speech at my institute in Washington saying that Korea would start looking very seriously at the advantages and challenges of joining TPP. That was in May of 2012. There was a concern about whether Japan would join or not,
Mm-hmm.
and Japan eventually did. There was a concern about sequencing of initiatives with China. And for both economic and political reasons, there was a lot of interest in trying to advance the Korea-China negotiations before
Mm-hmm.
conducting the TPP negotiations. But when Japan joined in 2013, it really put Korea on the spot. And frankly, Korea hesitated and procrastinated and lost its opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to be an original member.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that comes at a cost because now Korea is not eligible to join the TPP until it enters into force. There are procedures in the TPP
Mm-hmm.
that allow countries to accede, and there's a general recognition that Korea is certainly at the top of the list of countries that are ready, willing, and able to join, and they would have to undertake negotiations with the existing members, but they've already been talking to all of the existing members about what will happen in the future as the TPP enters into force. The wild card on the timing of that is when will the TPP enter into force? The text is now public, so everyone can read it. There will be a very challenging debate in the U.S. Congress next year. Whether there is a vote to ratify and implement and pass implementing legislation for the TPP is up in the air. I think there's still a good chance that Congress will pass implementing legislation by the summer of next year. But there are many people who say the politics are so sour in Washington that nothing can happen. And it will have to wait until after the election or even into the next administration. There are lots of problems with that. I can go into more detail if people want the letter and verse on that. But for Korea, the benefits that would derive from being a member of TPP will be postponed until the agreement enters into force and Korea can pursue its accession negotiations. Whether it does that alone or in conjunction with other countries who are also interested in joining will be a question as well.
Right.
So that's something that I think I've been cited quite a bit in the Korean press as saying that it was a strategic blunder for Korea to wait. There was no reason not to. It will be in a much more difficult negotiating position vis-a-vis Japan in negotiating accession as opposed to being a negotiating partner among the original signatories. But it will also have to face more demands from the U.S. Congress because the U.S. Congress always makes demands of everyone, including President Obama, and that's going to be the challenge for him in putting together implementing legislation and getting it passed through the Congress next year. So that's something that is going to be a concern.
Right.
Now, what we used to say the $64,000 question, but which is now the billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar question, inflation.
Asset price inflation, right?
Is what does China think about all of this?
Yeah.
And I have spent a lot of time with senior Chinese leaders, economic leaders, over the past few years, talking about TPP. First, explaining what it was about, what is in it. Now they have the opportunity to read it, the full text, and if they hadn't had that opportunity before. And they are doing an extensive analysis of what it means for their trade relations with TPP countries, what it means for the future projection of Asia-Pacific economic integration, uh,
Mhm.
what it means in terms of the expansion of membership in TPP, assuming Korea is going to move forward, but Indonesia just announced its interest in moving forward.
Right.
Philippines and Thailand have long been interested and have been trying to prepare for future membership. Taiwan, which is not included in almost any of the trade agreements in the Asia Pacific, and is discriminated by all of the ones that are in force, actively has been pushing for membership. Colombia wants to join. So there's a long list of countries that are trying to get ready in the intervening period to join the TPP. China is going to look at that. They're going to look at the implications for Chinese trade and investment, the prospects for trade diversion, somewhat limited, but not insignificant. They're going to look at how it affects Chinese-led initiatives, particularly those in the investment area, in which their new Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is a critical new vehicle for integration, and also how it affects their One Belt, One Road initiative for creating physical integration in the region for a variety of purposes. And they're going to look to see whether the TPP is something that makes sense for Chinese economic development strategies. Because there are many TPP reforms that some people said, well, China would never be able to live up to, but which are very consistent with the types of reforms on state-owned enterprises, disciplines on state-owned enterprises that the Chinese leadership have been pursuing incrementally for the past few years. They want to control the spending and the subsidies given to those enterprises. Some of them they're not going to be able to discipline because their benefactors in the military are just too strong. But there is a great interest in that area. Services reforms in China need a big push. I don't think Korea was a big enough partner to push China to the type of domestic reforms that China needs to make. The U.S. is making progress in that area, partially through its bilateral investment treaty negotiations with China. But China needs to do that if it is to be able to manage a soft landing on its economic restructuring and maintain the growth projections in the range of 6 to 6.5% for the rest of the decade. So there are a lot of reasons why China can see some advantages in adopting TPP disciplines, but there are some red lines that are very difficult for China as well. And then there is the basic political issue. There are people in Beijing who mistrust Washington. That's where you continue to hear all the talk about containment. And there are people in Washington that continue to mistrust Beijing. And it is and moving forward on a closer commercial relationship is inhibited by problems with cyber espionage, with the building of military, airfields on the islands in the South China Sea. So these are all complications where politics and strategic considerations interfere with a purely economic assessment of what's good policy.
Well, would China's joining the TPP be any more formidable than the task it faced joining WTO?
I think today, yes, absolutely.
Interesting.
Today, China is the world's leading trading country. And it has, become much more integrated in the world economy, and it is much richer, and it has still powerful military capabilities, and so it will be assessed differently than it was in 15 years ago.
Well, one final. I think there's a quick question before I open this up to the floor. If the TPP comes into force and Korea is first in line to be the new member, are we talking about a 1 year or a multi-year process for Korea to join the TPP?
I think Korea could join relatively quickly.
Okay.
It's doing
Mhm.
a lot of the homework
Mhm.
now with consultations.
Mhm.
It could proceed with a lot of
Mhm.
the pre-negotiations, or even do a lot of the preliminary negotiations on the market access schedules that would have to be approved by all the 12 countries before Korea could enter. That could be done during this intervening
Right.
period before the TPP enters into
Mhm.
force. So it doesn't have to be a protracted period,
Okay.
but it depends on the willingness of the existing members to start accepting new
Right.
participants early on
Okay. Good.
in the process.
Thank you. Well, I think that's it. So let's thank Jeff Schott for this for the expert view on Korean-China trade.
Thank you for having me.
Good. Thank you.
Just
And
like to
go ahead. You remind.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'd like to just remind you to make sure you complete your surveys, and you can hand them to any of our hardworking interns at the back of the room, or you can leave it at the front desk. I'd like to also thank our president, our senior VP of policy, Dr. Nerper, and Peter Stumke, who's in the sound booth, who works on all of our amazing e-products. We'll share the video and audio podcast to this program. Please share it with your networks. And we hope to see you back next week. We have an evening session on Korea and banking in the 1970s. We have 3 gentlemen here who have worked in Korea in the 1970s in the banking sector, who will talk about their experiences on the ground and the emergence of Korea in the financial sector.
Thanks,
Thank
Nikki.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.